Hey, good luck, everybody. Thank you so much for joining our webinar. This is a very, very significant week in the Chabad calendar, in the Jewish calendar, in the world calendar. 70 years ago, on the 28th of Sivan, the Rebbe and Rebbetzin came to America, and that revolutionized America. Gimel Tammuz next week, we're going to have a very special feature. It's the Rebbe's Yahrzeit, and Rabbi Kalabach will be part of a whole big program. So it's a very, very significant week. So to tell us more about Chof Ches, the 28th of Sivan, and the significance of the week, I want to thank Rabbi Kalabach for doing this every single week. Rabbi Kalabach, over to you.
Rabbi Masinta, good Foch, everybody. As was mentioned, on the 28th of Sivan, in 1941, during the Second World War, as we'll discuss at length, the great miracle happened 80 years ago when the Rebbe landed on the shores of United States in New York. Now, Halacha speaks about the importance and the relevance of a miracle. But a miracle that happens to an individual is not really significant to others. A miracle that occurs to a father and to oneself is of great importance. We say a bracha when we pass there, Shosali nes b'mokim hazeh. But a miracle that occurs to one's Rebbe, a Nossi is as one with all his generation. As the Rambam writes, the king is the heart of all Yidden. So, a miracle that occurs to the leader of our generation, to our Rebbe, is of significant importance to the entire Jewish people, as will be discussed shortly towards the end. I must say that in the past, very little was said of the Rebbe and Rebbetzins' miraculous escape from war-torn Europe. In fact, the exact date wasn't even known in public, only to a few, until they printed the 5th volume of the previous Rebbe's Igros Kodesh letters, and that was in 1983. And the previous Rebbe informs of the good news in a letter dated 28th of Sivan, 5701, in 1941. Even so, Hasidim only started commemorating the day 3 years later, only in 1986. That year, 28th of Sivan, Koyach Sivan, coincided with Shabbos, and they planned a Melave Malka Farbrengen. That Shabbos afternoon, the Rebbe held the usual Shabbos Mevarchim Farbrengen, as we have Shabbos Mevarchim Tammuz this Shabbos, and he spoke about the day publicly for the first time in 1986, and he called it the dawn of a new era in Hafotzas Hamayonos, going to Kadar HaTachtoin, as America was called, the lower part of the planet. In between the sichos, Reb Meir Harlik approached the Rebbe to notify him of the Farbrengen in honor of the Rebbe's rescue. And with a glowing smile, the Rebbe corrected Reb Meir. It's not just the Rebbe's rescue, but Ish Iboy Ubesoy, a man and his household, implying that the Rebbe and Rebbetzins' escape were together. And with this, the Rebbe gave Reb Meir Harlik a bottle of mashke for the Farbrengen. From then on, Chof Ches Sivan was marked by Hasidim worldwide as a day of celebration with Farbrengens and Hachlotes Tevis, good resolutions relating to, as the Rebbe called it, Hafotzas Hamayonos, to spread the wells of Hasidus even further And I would urge everybody listening and everybody who notices to Tuesday is the 28th of Sivan, and to take a Hachlota Teva, put on tefillin with one more Jew, study more Chassidus. And from 1987 on, the Rebbe was Magia. He personally gave out a mimer in honor of the day. And the greatest anniversary was in the year 1991, which we'll discuss shortly. And hopefully, with no load shedding, Rabbi Masinta will be able to show us 2 videos on that special Chof Ches Sivan in 1991, which we'll also discuss. And only recently were the precise details of the Rebbe and Rebbetzins' miraculous journey discovered, and the continuous miracles that Hashem did, resulting in the Rebbe and Rebbetzins' ultimate escape, is truly remarkable. And so let's start on the journey of the Rebbe's escape. So let's start with, even before Rosh Hashanah, I would like to tell you a very interesting story which happened before the German military invaded Poland and World War began. That was shortly before Rosh Hashanah in 1940. 2 months before that, in the month of Av, in 1939, there was a group of Bochrim in New York who were close to Chabad, that Rabbi Jacobson decided that they will go to Otwock, the Lubavitcher Yeshiva in Poland, to learn there. And they were Rabbi Meir Greenberg, Rabbi Avram Hecht, Yitzchak Kolodny, Zerach Gordon, and Mordechai Fisher, and also Mordechai Dave Altai. The Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, paid $460 at that time for them to come to Otwock. And it is our Rebbe, actually, who sent the check to it. And the previous Rebbe writes to the Rebbe that they are coming to study. They went on a ship which landed in France. And from there, they took a train to Paris. When they came to Paris, they went to Rabbi Zalman Schneerson, a cousin of the Rebbe, to have a meal. And then they went back to the train station where they met our Rebbe. And in the train station, Rabbi Greenberg tells, the Rebbe had medicine for the previous Rebbe, and he said, please give this to him when you see him in Otwock. And then the Rebbe came onto the train with them, and he was speaking to them about Chassidus and Torah and all kinds of things. The train was in the station for 4 hours. When it came time to depart, they rang the whistle that they're going to soon leave. And the Rebbe continued talking, and as if he didn't hear anything. And some of the students said, the whistle has gone. The train's about to leave. The Rebbe looked at his clock, his watch, and he said, no, there is still time. The whistle blew another 9 times. And on the 10th, the Rebbe looked at his watch and he said, now I have to go. But we will be mamshich. We will continue what we have talked about. And the Rebbe left the train And the minute he left, the train took off. The train went through Berlin, and in Berlin, a policeman came to check all the baggages there, and if there was any illicit drink, and even medicine was forbidden. And the police came over to him, 1939, in Berlin, and he said, "Are you carrying anything forbidden?" I said, "No." He opened up the suitcase, took out the medicine, said, "What is this?" He said, "Nothing." And to the great surprise, the police said, "Well, if you say it's nothing, you could close the suitcase." And the medicine reached the previous Rebbe in peace. They couldn't believe their eyes. And now we say words of prophecy. When the Rebbe came to New York on the 28th of Sivan in 1941, and he made a Fabrengen, as we'll discuss, he turned to those 6 Bochrim and he said, "Now we can continue that which we began in Paris." Can you imagine that? But not only that, you will see on the video, if we get to show it, that in 1991, on the 28th of Sivan, the Rebbe had come back from the oil. We'll still discuss that at length. And as you know, when the Rebbe went to the oil, he was fasting. And 28th of Sivan in New York is the summertime. Just like this Shabbos is the earliest Shabbos, 5:05 in Johannesburg, obviously it's the latest in New York. So there was a break between Mincha and Ma'ariv, you're talking about at 9:15, and Rabbi Katz, the Gabbai, announced that now we'll make a hafsaka, an interruption for 15 minutes, and they were hoping the Rebbe would go and eat something. And the Rebbe there said, "Why should we be mafsik? Let us make a hamshacha. Let us make a continuation." And these were the exact words that the Rebbe told those 6 Bochrim on the train in 1939 when they went to Otvotsk, and then when he met them again in 1941. Now we can be mamshech. By the way, those Bochrim left just before the war and made it back to America safely. So they were not there too long. Before Rosh Hashanah, as we know, September 1st, the German military invaded Poland. World War II broke out. There was such fear amongst the Hasidim in America, who understood that the previous Rebbe, then living in Otvotsk, Poland, was in dire peril. Agudas Chasidei Chabad in America, led by Rabbi Yisrael Jacobson and Mr. Sam Kramer, a Chassid who did a fortune for Chabad in those days, began efforts to get the previous Rebbe out of Poland and ultimately to the United States. With the breakdown of regular communication, much of the information needed for the rescue was passed through a European channel. And the Rebbe and Rebbetzin, who were living in Paris, France, a country that was not yet heavily involved in the war, he passed on the information to the Americans and begged them to do everything in their power to save the previous Rebbe from Nazi hands. It's a story on its own. The many activities and the many shlichusim that the Rebbe did for the previous Rebbe in Atomim and being a personal secretary, what he was doing in France. Just by the way, he went from in 1929, after his wedding, he and his Rebbetzin moved to Berlin in 1933, when Hitler came to power in Machshamoy, and they saw the danger. They went to France, and there they would be from 1933 till 1941. While waiting for various permits for the previous Rebbe, the lawyer dealing with the operation, Max Rhodes, was asked to see in the interim what could be done for the Rebbe and Rebbetzin, as well as for the youngest daughter of the previous Rebbe, Rebbetzin Shena, and her husband, also Rabbi Mendel Horenstein. Being that Paris was not yet occupied by the Germans, they hoped that the Rebbe would be able to be brought over quite easily. And as Rabbi Jacobson wrote in his letter, it's very important to do that because our Rebbe would use his unique organizational capabilities to assist in the effort to save the previous Rebbe. Now, visas were not easy to come by. They were extremely complicated in those days. And as we know, many Jews were trapped in Europe and couldn't get out because of visa issues. At that time, in 1939, the easiest way to apply for a visa to the States was to show the authorities that a refugee would not be a burden on society. So that Kislev, an affidavit was sent to the Rebbe declaring that he was a qualified engineer who would be self-supportive in the United States. With such a paper in hand, the process to apply for an immigration visa in America consulate in Paris would have been simple. And these applications generally took about a half a year to process. So efforts were made to speed up the process. However, those efforts sadly were unsuccessful. And then the team realized that the previous Rebbe and his family could be eligible for a special path of rescue. And that was called a non-quota visa, which would enable them to skip the regular queue were requested from the State Department. And the basis was that the previous Lubavitch Rebbe was a vital asset to the entire Jewish nation. And our Rebbe was described as being involved in running Chabad operations and, most importantly, an intellectual of the highest caliber and would be a major contributor to Jewish thought. However, there was a problem. Before the war started, they had applied for a visa in which he was documented as an engineer. And the lawyers decided that it would be better to leave the Rebbe and Rebbetzin out of this special request because they were not under Nazi occupation and they weren't in immediate danger, so they left the Rebbe's name out for the time being. The miracles that happened in which they freed the previous Rebbe bore fruit. It's a long story. How they got him out of Poland with a German officer. They got him to Berlin. He arrived to Riga, Latvia on the 5th of Teves. 3 months he waited for the entry visas into the States, and then they boarded the SS Drottningholm for the Atlantic voyage, and we know that they came to America Tes Oder Sheni in 1940. And from that day on, the previous Rebbe led the efforts to bring the Rebbe and Rebbetzin from France, as well as Rebbetzin Shena and Reb Mendel Horenstein, who were stranded in Poland. They had gone to Poland to look after Reb Mendel Horenstein's elderly father who was sick. They became trapped there, sadly, and they lost their lives in Treblinka. Rebbetzin Shena on the second day of Rosh Hashanah, and Reb Mendel on the 25th of Cheshvan in 1943. So they tried to get the non-quota visas for the Rebbe and Rebbetzin. But there were certain obstacles that they had, including the fact that they had applied for a regular visa as an engineer. In the beginning of Sivan, 5700, the Nazis defeated the French on the 2nd of Iyar. And the people noticed that it was very dangerous for Jews to stay in France. And so they tried to get to the train station and get out of there. Now, a French general offered the Rebbe his summer home in the outskirts of Paris as a hideout. The Rebbe miraculously, again, thank God, rejected the offer and sought to escape to the south of the country, to the city of Vichy, far from the center of Nazi activity. The Rebbetzin would later relate that the train station was packed. They were unable to find a place on the train. But a high-ranking official, that same general, offered to use his connections to obtain tickets. And as Shavuos approached, they managed to escape Paris. Before leaving, the Rebbe spoke to the Jews, encouraging them to be steadfast in their Judaism, even in the worst trials and tribulations. And this wasn't merely talk, because they knew how the Rebbe had sacrificed for the minutest parts of halacha and Yiddishkeit, as we'll discuss. The train arrived in Vichy on Erev Shavuos. And by the way, this was one of the last trains, because 3 days later, the Nazis entered into Paris, and then it became too late to leave. As the train came in, the sun had set, Shavuos was coming in, the Rebbe hired a wagon driver to transport the suitcases of Kesovim and other important documents. The Rebbe was left with suitcases of Chasidus by the previous Rebbe. Those were saved while much of the previous Rebbe's library remained in Poland. Those are stories on its own. The Rebbetzin said she couldn't walk, so she sat on the wagon with the luggage, and the Rebbe walked the entire time to the destination. It was a time that there was no question. It was pikuach nefesh, and you could do whatever you needed to save a life. But the Rebbe insisted on walking. And these ksovim, the Rebbe would print later. In Vichy, they settled down to wait for a visa. I have a cousin, Mrs. Hadassah Karlbach, who is married to the late Eliachaim Karlbach. She is the daughter of the Zalman Schneerson in Paris, whom many stories are told about, and who Rebbetzin Chana stayed with. He was quite close to the Rebbetzin, would visit her quite often. And she told, the Rebbetzin said that although many times in her life she had to flee from place to place, and she and the Rebbe lived out of suitcases, she always arranged the suitcases in a way that their lodging should have a semblance of a home. The Rebbe and Rebbetzin stay in Vichy lasted until the end of Tammuz, which would be about 12 weeks later. And that time, it turned out that even though it was considered neutral, the leader, Peten Yamach Shemoy, turned out to be a puppet for the Nazis. And it was very dangerous to stay in Vichy. So they had to flee again. And they went to, they would go to Nice. The Jews at the city at that time remember how his mother would go with the Rebbetzin to watch the cows being milked for Cholav Yisrael. And the Rebbe would speak with the Jews in writing. He also wrote 6 long entries into his Reshimis about the different parts of Torah, including our Bod Tzrichim Lahodos, the obligation to recite Hagomel when saved for danger. But the Rebbe would not be able to recite that bracha for almost an entire year. So, as mentioned, a week after the German invasion of France, the Nazis installed a puppet government, which chose its seat in Vichy. And it was a very anti-Semitic place, so they went to Nice, and the visa issues persisted. They were informed that the consulate was planning on issuing the non-quota visas for the United States, but the Rebbe and Rebbetzin were having difficulties. In the beginning of Cheshvan, 5701, it was decided they cannot get a non-quota visa since a regular visa application had been submitted for the Rebbe using the title of engineer and someone knowledgeable in physics, not as a rabbi. So, with what seemed to be a discrepancy in the application, they refused to grant regular visas as well. The State Department at the time had ordered its embassies to use every possible excuse to delay granting US papers to refugees, especially to Jews. The Rebbe ate almost nothing. He was staying in a hotel, and they noticed, the managers of the hotel noticed the Rebbe ate so little, they collected some sugar, a major commodity, and they would pass it on to the Rebbetzin. As Sukkot neared, there's a Rabbi Tachtel that tells the Rebbe approached a Rav, Reb Shmuel Yaakov Rubinstein. Was it permissible to slip over the border to Italy to obtain an esrog from Calabria for Sukkot? And the Rebbe suddenly disappeared for a couple of days. When he arrived back, his face was shining. He had succeeded in getting 2 esrogim. One he gave to this Rabbi Rubinstein, and the second he used himself, obviously, and allowed all the Yidden in the city to bless over it as well. Meanwhile, back in New York, the previous Rebbe was heartbroken at the failure of the rescue effort. And he tries to do everything. He says, I'm broken and pained by the extent of difficulty. There was a lawyer, Osher Rabinowitz, whose father was a very, very big chassid of the previous Rebbe. And he came to speak to Rebbe, but the Rebbe said it hadn't been helped, the previous Rebbe. And finally, in Tavis, the Rebbe's case was taken up by HIAS, the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society. And they said that the Rebbe should apply for a regular visa as a Russian refugee, and they should go to the American consulate in Marseille, complete with all their documents in February. So the Rebbe traveled 100 miles from Nice to Marseille, and there he would eventually obtain the visas. You see, the head of the consulate in Nice was an anti-Semite, while the head of the Marseille consulate was a supporter of Jews. And so maybe that's why the switch. The efforts took time. And at the end of winter in 1941, they finally, on Purim, the previous Rebbe received a telegram that our Rebbe will receive a visa on the 17th of April and the 20th of Nisan. And the Rebbetzin writes a letter to her father saying that they have been granted visas, and when those will be delivered, they will be able to carry on. And finally, on the 20th of Nisan, they were given the visas. The only trouble was that the only ships leaving Europe were from Portugal. Portugal was then considered a non-aligned country. It was out, it was neutral, and you could get a ship to the States from there. But to be able to travel from Nice to Portugal, such a business in those days, you had to get a transit visa. The previous Rebbe didn't rest, and he did all the efforts necessary. Finally, they were given visas, and the Rebbe and Rebbetzin reached Portugal on they got tickets on one of the last ships to leave Europe. It was all very exciting, and they suddenly received a telegram from the previous Rebbe saying, do not go on that ship. Some of their friends said, that's Meshuggah. You finally get a chance to get out. Who knows what it'll be? But obviously, being Chassidim of their Rebbe, they followed the previous Rebbe's instructions. And it later turned out that that entire ship, which they were supposed to go on, was captured by the Italians. And all the people on that ship were kept in Italy as prisoners of war until the war was over. But they needed to obtain ship tickets once more. In New York, there was a man called Rabbi Mordechai Bistritsky. His grandson, by the way, is Ingi Bistritsky, who is one of the heads of Hatzalah in Crown Heights. And this Rabbi Mordechai Bistritsky has a son by the name of Rabbi Leibel Bistritsky, who is very close to the Rebbe. And he would stand there by Koshel Bracha. And his son tells that his father, Reb Mordechai Bistritsky, wanted to bring grandparents from Antwerp to America. They needed transit visas to go from France to the ship, and they didn't manage to get the transit visas in time. And his father, Reb Mordechai Bistritsky, had these two tickets, and he was aware that the Rebbe and Rebbetzin were stuck in Portugal and needed these tickets. He went to the previous Rebbe and said that he's ready to turn over his tickets to the Rebbe. And Baruch Hashem, miraculously, actually, they saved the Rebbe and Rebbetzin. The Rebbe, by the way, the previous Rebbe insisted on paying back for those tickets. And one day before departing on that voyage, the Rebbe, as we know from his Reshimis, wrote a scholarly, deep teaching on an obscure passage, and it is dated the 16th of Sivan, 5701. On the 17th of Sivan, the Rebbe and Rebbetzin boarded the ship Serpa Pinto for the trip from Lisbon to New York. You could see, by the way, there's Rebbe's signature with stickers on that boat. The voyage was a very dangerous one. German U-boat submarines patrolled Europe's territorial waters, and the ship had the word Portugal across its side with the hope that, excuse me, Portugal's neutrality would keep the Germans from bombing. As they left Europe's waters, the Rebbe sent a telegram to the previous Rebbe telling him of the development. Monday morning, Chof Ches Sivan, 1941, 80 years ago from Tuesday, the ship docked at Ellis Island. Rabbi Yitzchak Groner, our Rabbi Groner's father, relates that the night before he was notified, he was staying outside the previous Rebbe's room with his father, awaiting Yechidus, as he was going to join the yeshiva, and Rabbi Jacobson came out with a piece of news. Rabbi Jacobson went to my father, and he told him that the Rebbe had said the yeshiva should go out and greet the Rebbe when he arrives. He said, my son-in-law is fluent in the entire Talmud, Shas, Tosfos, Rosh, Ran, and all the printed Hasidic Sfarim. I don't know if we understand fully what that means in learning. And when we came to the pier, there were blockades. We couldn't get to the ship. We saw how the Rebbetzin, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe's Rebbetzin, came to greet them. But first, the Rebbe's wife, the Rebbetzin, came out, followed by the Rebbe. He gave Shalom Aleichem to all the family members who had come to greet him. And then Rabbi Jacobson brought him to the Bochrim. He gave Shalom Aleichem to every Bocher. Rabbi Posner, who was a young Bocher at that time, remembers how the cars pulled up in front of 770. The Rebbetzin got out of the car, and then the Rebbe, they walked up the stairs at that time. And the previous Rebbe wrote messages to people. The Hasidim asked the Rebbe to honor them with a Farbrengen to celebrate the momentous occasion. It was Tuesday that he had Monday that he arrived, and he said, on Thursday night, after I had the opportunity of benching Gaimal, that's when I will Farbreng. And it was really very interesting about that Farbrengen. And as I say, it was only on 1983, 1983, that they found out what had happened at that time. And the most memorable celebration of the day was Chof Ches Sivan. Just before I forget, the previous Rebbe, who obviously was over the moon to have his son-in-law and daughter with him, but the Rebbe explained that it took 2 or 3 days till they were called to see him, because Chassidus teaches that your mind has to guide your emotions. And the previous Rebbe needed that time to feel right, to see his son-in-law. That night, it was Sunday night, 1991, the Rebbe had been to the oil and he entered for Ma'ariv. The shul was packed, and he said he was going to give out a kavitz, a special booklet, all on the on Chof Ches Nissen. So the Rebbe returned from the Ohel approximately 20 minutes before sunset and entered the shul for Mincha. Following Mincha, the Rebbe came down from the Bimah and received a blessing, which if we can show you the video, you'll see Reb Zalman Gerari giving the Rebbe a bracha. And it was a very special emotion as he referenced the spiritual transformation that the Rebbe had orchestrated in the world since he came in 1941, and he wished the Rebbe measurable success in continuing in this direction. All the while, the Rebbe stood with closed eyes and occasionally seemed to wipe away a tear. It was a most stirring moment to behold. When he finished the bracha, the Rebbe lifted his eyes and said, "There are Kohanim here. Let them also recite Birchas Kohanim." Rabbi Yosef Gutnik then came over and blessed the Rebbe with Birchas Kohanim, and the Rebbe began a sicha that lasted for a quarter of an hour. He made mention also of 770. And as I said, that after Ma'ariv, the Gabbai Reb Zev Katz announced in the name of the Maskiris that since the booklets have not yet arrived from the printer, there would be a short intermission, a hefsek for 15 minutes. And the Rebbe spent almost the entire day at the oil. He was still fasting. They hoped the Rebbe would go to his room and break his fast. Instead, the Rebbe smiled broadly and he said, "A hefsek, that would be a waste of time. We'll make a hemshach," as I mentioned at the beginning. And he began another sikha for 10 minutes. And then at 9:20, he gave out the kavitz. 3 hours, 1991. He was fasting that whole day. He was giving out the distribution, and he seemed in high spirits, smiling to everyone, especially children. And at 12:02, he left the shul, singing the Ufaratsta. And later that, when the Rebbe left, there was joyous dancing, and a magnificent Farbrengen came to pass, which lasted into the early hours of the morning. I'd like to point out that Chof Ches Sivan is a very special date, Koyach Sivan. And you know that the Rebbe came to New York twice. In 1941. And then in 1947, the Rebbe went back to France to bring his mother back to New York. She had escaped from Russia. He was there for about 3 months while they organized the paperwork. The Rebbetzin had stayed at Reb Zalman Schneerson, this Rebbetzin Adassa Kolbach's father, and he accompanied his mother on a ship. Ships in those days especially were unpredictable. Do you know what date they came back to New York in 1947? You guessed it, the same date, 28th of Sivan. And as someone explains, in a way, Sivan is the time of the giving of the Torah. And this is the date that Hashem gave us the koyach Sivan, the power of Sivan, and gave us our Rebbe to be able to transform the entire world, starting from, as they call it, the Kadur HaTachtoin, the lowest part of the planet. And the Rebbe explains that until then, we hadn't yet reached the lowest part of the planet. And if you want to pick up a building, if you start from any of the top floors or the middle floors and you pick it up, you won't get the whole building. It is only if you put a lever at the bottom of the building and pick it up from there that you pick up the whole building, the physical and the spiritual. And that's what was started on the 28th of Sivan, the whole new transformation of the world. And let us pray as we celebrate 28th of Sivan this Tuesday. Take your good resolutions to do more mitzvahs, to spread Chassidus, and let's hope that this can pick up the lever of the entire world to redemption. Thank you, Rabbi Masinta. See if you can show those two videos of that date, 28th Sivan, 1991, which was 50 years after the Rebbe had been freed, and now we're going to be celebrating 80 years. Does it go?
It was the year Tafshinun Aleph, which was for us a very significant year in many ways because it marked 50 years from when the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin came to America. So after consulting with colleagues and others, I wrote a note into the Rebbe saying that L'Kovid, the special day, Chamishim Shana of Chav Ches Sivan, the Rebbe's arrival and the Rebbe's pulas and activities that began 50 years ago, that we'd like to suggest publishing a Kevitz Chav Ches Sivan Chamishim Shana, knowing from previous experience that the Rebbe would only want Torah in there and not just history and biography. So I wrote that it would include sichos that explain the significance of Chav Ches Sivan. And we'd also have some of the background of the Hatzalah of the Rebbe and the Rebbetzins being saved from Europe. The Rebbe responded that we should consult with Agudas Chassidei Chabad and Tzirei Agudas Chabad. V'hei b'atzlacha Rabba. We wrote up a very graphical sketch of what had happened, all the activities of the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin as they came over from Europe, how they were saved. And I have to say, that was a lot of work. A lot of research, because we're talking about something that happened 50 years ago. Most of the eyewitnesses were not around, and those that were didn't really remember everything. So we did a lot of work, and a lot of people helped, really. I remember at least 20 people were doing research and calling people and interviews. Then the second section was sichos connected to the significance of what this day is, the significance of the Rebbe coming to America. What is America? It wasn't just another location that Chabad relocated. It was a whole new paradigm shift. So there were a bunch of 4 sichos on that, and 4 maimorim that the Rebbe had edited in previous years in honor of Chav Ches Sivan, and one that I actually edited in honor of this Quintris. We had no clue at the time that the Rebbe was going to give out this kavitz, but there was still a great schus to do this. And then, on the day the Rebbe went to the oil, I got a phone call Rabbi Groner is on the phone. He says to me, how many kuntresim did you print, or are you going to print? So I said, I don't know, 2,000 to 3,000. He says, what will it take to print 10,000? You know, I didn't know why he asked me that question. So I said, 10,000? I'll ask the printer. Once they're printing, it shouldn't be a big thing. He says, can you make sure that we have 10,000 tonight after Mincha Ma'ariv time? He didn't tell me immediately. I right away suspected why 10,000 wasn't just to hang around. It was because, and the Rebbe had given out kontresim already for different dates. So I suspected it. So I asked him. So he says, yeah, but I shouldn't tell anybody. The printing started, told the printer to print 10,000. I think they printed even more than 10,000 just in case, 12,000, 15,000. These burgundy covers, they started coming to 770. I remember boxes coming. I mean, I was already not involved in that part of it. That was already more the technical. The Rebbe gave it out. It was a big, big simcha for everyone, for us especially, all those that worked on it. And it became like an official document that the Rebbe himself endorsed, the Rebbe gave out. So on this special day, as we honor 80 years when the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin came to America, and this new stage, so in addition to us all recommitting and initiating new efforts to strengthen our iskashus to the Rebbe's activities, the Rebbe's Torah, the Rebbe's Pu'ulas, above all, to actually learn in this kuntras.
There's one more video to show.
Rebbetzin Chayamushka Schneerson was born in Bobanovich, near the town of Lubavitch, in Belarus, in 1901.
There was a lot of excitement. There was a lot of
Upon her birth, her grandfather, the fifth Rebbe, chose a name for her, telegraphing from abroad, if she hasn't been named yet, she should be called Chayamushka.
Her childhood was spent at the seat of the Lubavitch movement as the granddaughter and daughter of generations of the revered Rebbe's of Chabad. When leadership of the movement was placed upon her father's shoulders, he continuous.
Alex, I don't know how to do this, sorry.
Right. Okay, there's a very special video.
Entrusted his middle daughter with the power to conduct all legal
Maybe I
transactions.
should be able to in a future thing.
1 second, let's just try it again. Oh.
Okay. Because there you see
My
the
kid is not
actual-
here. Hold on 1 second.
You see the actual evening and the blessing that Reb Zalman Garari gives.
Anticipation. There was a lot of the
Oh.
air was electrified. A strong feeling of something dramatic, something major is taking place. Every little thing that happened was fantastic. Just like the original year when the Rebbe came to America in Tafshin Aleph, it was on Monday. Chav Ches Sivan Nun Aleph was also on Monday. Shabbos was a Farbrengen, the Rebbe Farbrengen, a very special Farbrengen, during which Rameir Harlig, Zolzang Gesund und Stark, got a bottle from the Rebbe, a bottle of L'chaim, to distribute by the Farbrengen. Chav Ches Sivan, the Rebbe went to the oil. The Rebbe came back unusually early. Because we knew that the Rebbe was going to be giving out a kuntras, we were able to be in 770 for Mincha Ma'ariv. I'm talking about from All Torah. We were able to be in 770 for Mincha Ma'ariv. After Mincha, the Rebbe went down off of his stage, went to the table that he usually gave out dollars from, or kontresim. Rabbi Zalman Garari had the great schos that he used to give the Rebbe the brachas, B'Emu B'Yira B'Eses B'Ziyah, giving or sharing the feelings of every chassid and the wishes of every chassid to the Rebbe.
Seien sich alle bestattet von der Broche und mit Schluchosai, Kardinen, Menschen, dem Rebben, sein, gesund, Poshet und Geruchtis und Gashmis, Hoben, Ariches, Yomim, Bishonim, Tevis, gesund.
Afterwards, the Rebbe, this was a unique thing, maybe it happened, that the Rebbe requested that Birchas Kohanim should be recited as well. Yossel Gutnick approached and he recited Birchas Kohanim. So this in itself, all of this is, the Bachrim are there, we were all there from All Torah. This is watching this, participating, this was absolutely unbelievable. And then the Rebbe said a sicha.
Mi verbindt sich allemal mit dem Tag, in welcher eine gute Sache passiert. Bis wann ist hat der ganze Tag wird angerufen, jedem Sacker. Der Teke von mir hat Mama betascht.
After the Rebbe finished the Sikha, the Rebbe said that he will give out dollars. Rabbi Groner told the Rebbe that the dollars were packed together with the kontresim. The intention was, or what was hoped, was because the Rebbe was standing at the oil all day, which means that the Rebbe didn't eat. The idea was that the Rebbe would go up to his room after Meir for a few minutes and then to give out the kontresim. They want to give out the kontresim at night, but to have somewhat of a break. The Rebbe washes his hands, washes nagelwasser at the place of giving out the dollars, and the Rebbe goes back up to the bima to daven Ma'ariv. After Ma'ariv, Rabbi Zev Katz, soll sein gesund und stark, announced that the Rebbe will be distributing kontresim, then mit sein gerät. It will be in approximately 15 minutes. The Rebbe gave a big smile. The Rebbe said, "Statt machna hefsek, kann man doch machna hemshech," which is in itself something that is so significant. And the Rebbe went down once again from the bima, went over to the place where he distributed the distributions, where the dollars were kontresim, and the Rebbe said another sikha of approximately 10 minutes.
Gefindt mir sich in dem Kirch von Jalchis Klisoye, beteich Adosh Meite Teise, weit weike Teke von Miyad Mamash.
Bachram received the kuntris, and we discovered the kavitz, and we discovered they're a very different type of kavitz. The type of things that the Rebbe gave out, the type of kontresim that the Rebbe gave out, were usually chassidus from Rebbe Seinu Nesienu, and over here, not just we're celebrating Chav Chasivan the way we did, and not just as the Rebbe said one sikha, another sikha, but here the Rebbe is sharing a kavitz that has there very personal things. The Rebbe's Nes HaTzala, the Nes of how the Rebbe made it out of Europe and came to America, the significance of the Rebbe coming to America, and this, by Bachrim, expressed the deep connection and personal connection with the Rebbe. The great joy and the excitement that every Bacher felt at that point after receiving the kuntris was unbelievable.
Shkoyach. Rabbi Mesinta, let us strengthen with Koyach Sivan, especially 80 years. Let us do our thing and bring Mashiach. Thank you.
Amen. Amen.